I'm really pleased to have Hayley with us. Hayley is Vice President at Q Advisors. A number of you will probably know or have heard of Q Advisors, one of the predominant M&A and banks in this space. M&A advisors and banks in this cloud space has done a number of the deals, and we've come across each other for the last, decade or so, working in this space. So what I wanted to do in this session was just kind of explore very briefly some of the trends, because obviously we could talk for hours about the trends that we're seeing in the M&A field. So I think we have a slide to sort of stimulate our first discussion, which is the discussion we always have, which is what's happening to valuations and what's going on in terms of volumes and pieces. So with a bit of luck, does that look familiar? Yeah, so I think the first discussion we wanted to have was just around what is happening with valuations and the kind of volumes of deals that are in the market. So Hayley, maybe you could give us your kind of trends in valuations and what you're seeing, and maybe I'll chip in as well as we go. So
absolutely. And should I?
Yes, use that. Are you on?
Is that working now?
Yeah, people can hear okay? Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. I think, as you can see in the slide that we're showing, there's been a little bit of a pullback in terms of public valuations. We have broken up this space into three categories, and I think these days the labeling is difficult because there's quite a convergence of what some of the solution providers are actually providing these days, and many of the logos you see on the screen are, could be categorized probably in each of the three. But in looking at the overall, market over the last, let's see, what's the period there? Last year. But if we expanded that beyond, there's been a bit of a decline. I think if you look at Ring Central and others that were trading, I think at one point it was like 27 times revenue, which was very high and interesting.
Punchy,
Yeah, exactly. But I think from our perspective, at Q Advisors, we do a decent amount of public transactions or with public players, but the primary focus is on the private market. And so while there is a bit of a pullback and some convergence across the public and private valuations, I'd say the public in particular, multiples you see, there's more volatility. So the highs were really high and the lows have been quite low, but we haven't seen quite the same magnitude as it relates to a pullback. But one point I would mention is there's a little bit of a bid-ask spread right now, and more than in years past. I think just because there was a justification for some players given 27 times revenue, you can point to that as a comp and say, oh, well, my 2 or 3 times revenue makes more sense now because, I'm not asking for that. But I think today, there's just been a little bit less deal flow over the last 6 to 9 months. There are a lot of parties interested in making a move, but who, for one reason or another, and valuation being one of those, are just kind of waiting for now. But I think we expect there to be, especially in the second half of this year, a little bit of a domino effect where one big deal may happen or, a few others, and that will just create a cascade of some acquisitions that have frankly been a little bit on the bench, if you will, over the last few months.
But there still seems to be, where there's quality assets, they're getting quality valuations, and a focus more on EBIT and kind of the kind of not real business, that's the wrong word, but I've always, running my own business, profit has been quite important to me because I have wages and people to pay and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So, there seems to be much more of a focus on those pieces. And I think the other thing we've seen is sometimes the structure of the deals have changed because some of the shareholders who are in the business, may want to cap it, put in some of their chips, but not all of them, because they're looking, they believe fundamentally in the business and they want to see the growth, and so we're seeing some minority deals and other things coming along, which is, I think, interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's just a ton of interest in this space, and from the private equity standpoint, there is still a lot of dry powder, ready to invest within TMT in particular, but the cloud comms more specifically. And with debt, the debt market's rebounding too. I think we'll continue to see, whether it's minority or a majority transaction, private equity looking to be very active.
Yeah, and the other thing we were talking before we came up here was the kind of trends in what's, not sexy is the wrong word, but what gets value, or what's the trends that we're seeing and you're seeing in terms of what assets look interesting now. I mean, I think there was a little joke from Andrew that everybody is now calling themselves a security player, so you get an extra couple of times valuation. A little while ago, you had to be a CPaaS player to get, but then you look at this and you don't really fancy the 2.2 times revenue. So what are those trends? What are you seeing in terms of areas you think are particularly interesting to focus on?
Yeah, so taking a step back, I think some of the fundamentals. I'll get to the areas that are more sexy or exciting, as you said, but having profitable growth has never been more of focus. Really investing in maximizing that growth, but with a smarter return on investment. And also being integrated. So thinking of a cohesive business, regardless of how many solutions you may have, but having it be to the customer as well to an external party that may be looking to acquire you. Does it do all the pieces sum to more as a whole? But I think really trend-wise, there's been an incredible amount of airtime given to customer engagement, customer experience. I think CX is maybe the term of 2023, or the acronym. And you were saying, how did you define customer engagement compared to customer experience? I liked what you said.
Yeah, well, so I think people get tied up in particularly contact center, and actually where I see a lot of the value is decoupling contact center and taking some of the capabilities down to the SME. So I see it more about how enterprises engage with their customers. So, it's fascinating. People in the room will know we looked at the inbound market in the UK. I was shocked how big it still is. And it's big because that's all about how customers are engaging with their customers. And yes, we're talking about omni-channel. We talk about, so there's lots of technologies. We've got Kixi here and others, who've built technology that has focused on that, improving customer engagement. That doesn't have to be a large-scale omni-channel contact center, which actually is a very complex thing and a very specific market. So that's how I think about customer engagement. And so I like businesses that have got, they might be only it might be a small app, it might be a small capability that improves that. So that's kind of how I think about it a little bit. And we could, if we all had small customer engagement contact center businesses, you get asked all the time. We do a lot of, we're working with you guys as well, do a lot of market mapping and stuff like that. And, they're hard to find. And the ones who are on the market seem to have not read this slide and want sort of 10 to 15 times revenue. But, I think that's interesting. The other thing I think is interesting, we were talking a bit about as well, is this enablement piece. Yeah. So before, if I was a US provider wanting to go internationally, I might have said, I need to buy another platform provider like myself. Well, now, actually what I might need is some enablement technology and actually a wholesale player who's got SIP and numbering. So I'm quite interesting for some of those wholesale providers who might be in the audience, that I think some of those businesses might have some value, because actually I don't want another platform. I've probably already got my SME platform strategy sorted. If I haven't, I might buy one to do that. But if I'm looking, so I think it's going to be in a kind of interesting, when I'm working with some players, they're asking me, Matt, who are the interesting players who can give me regulation and numbering and SIP trunking? If you can give me that, what else do I need? So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And we've been a part of a lot of the consolidation in this space. But to your point, do you need additional platforms everywhere you go? I think it can be synergistic in a lot of ways and additive, but it can also further complicate. So it's the enablement angle, and I think we're seeing a lot more, regardless of if they're actual acquisitions, but even just partnerships across the space, because it does make a lot of sense.
And I was talking to your colleague in the US recently, which is kind of a off-piece, but he was saying, unfortunately, a lot of investors, talking to Jerry, who was saying a lot of investors are now doing multiple diligence when they're going into deals. So there's, right now, which is annoying for you, but good for me. What we're finding is investors are very conscious of really checking everything because of, their worry about the market, where we are in the market, and they've got a bit more cautious. So, I work on deals where there might be 5 or 6 diligence partners who are doing different things, on the deal. So I think the scrutiny that businesses are going under now, and if you're going to go into a process, and we've done some work with people in the room on getting them prepared for that by doing, having my team do diligence before they go for a process, because actually, when you get into the process, you can't believe what, some intelligent, some not so intelligent people will ask you, you've been on many calls where I've been on with people, and, the people on the other side have really nearly wanted to kill the person because they've asked them for the 15th time about something inane. But you've got to get ready because there's going to be a lot of scrutiny, I think, now as well.
Yeah, and especially in Europe, we've seen just more willingness, I think, from investors and from, if you're preparing for a sell-side process, to have financial, tax, commercial, technical diligence done on the front end, because you don't really know what will become a problem until you're in the middle of a process. And but yeah, having a very defined strategy and being able to articulate that well it goes a long way. Just right now to hold value and to make sure there are no big red flags towards the end of our process.
Yeah, and I think, like we said earlier, business cases are under a lot of scrutiny. So, we spend our life looking at forecasts and sort of saying, well, how did that moment of miracle happen?
Hockey stick.
The hockey stick, it's all going to happen in 3 years.
It's always, 18 months to 3 years out?
Yeah. It's never close enough.
Yeah.
Normally after the
baker,
founders
so
left, yeah. So after a year buyout, it's then in the 18th month that it all happens magically. So I think the other area of M&A is around sort of specialization, where people are becoming more specialized. What's your thoughts around how you're seeing that play out?
Yeah, so I think there's a few elements that are very key. So one is verticalization. Where do you play? And that doesn't need to be, of the topics I'll talk about here, you don't need to be highly focused in each of them. But, we have a managed network and cloud infrastructure client in the US, and they are highly specialized within financial services and healthcare. And they've had a ton of success because, those are the markets they're targeting. That's all they do. And they really execute well because of that narrow focus. But beyond vertical, I think also target markets. You don't need to be everything to everyone, and staying focused, whether it's the SMEs or maybe it's highly focused on large enterprise in the mid-market. It's nice to have solutions or a full portfolio that may span up and down, but if you're really good at what you're good at and targeting a market or a vertical, that actually goes a really long way, especially if you're looking for external validation, if you will, and maybe as a target for someone else, you may fit a hole that they currently have because you're highly specialized, within each of those.
And that's probably why we're seeing some of the divestitures we've seen. So we've seen some big companies divest certain assets because probably they've realized they've got to focus back on my mother would say focus on the knitting, but focus on that sort of core business. So that's
absolutely, and I think we'll continue to see some divestitures. Just selling off some non-core units or refocusing where you want to play, whether it's geography or solutions even. I think that being highly focused is more of an emphasis more than ever.
Yeah, and it's a good question whether you need to be so deep in all the countries. Yeah. There was certainly if you're in the SME market, do you really need to, I was talking to an investor the other day and said, well, if the provider can't be in the top 4 providers or 5 providers in that market, why are they bothering? If there isn't a route to success, why are they just kind of ticking boxes? Yeah. And that, I think, is been an area that kind of people have focused on as well.
Yeah, Michael Quinn, our founding partner, often says it's sometimes better to be a mile deep than a mile wide. And I think there's benefit to being geographically spread, but you want to still be a leader in all of your markets and make sure that it's making enough of a impact.
And I think the other thing is you need scale. So certainly if you're doing R&D, so it's interesting that a number of the players we heard from earlier have all got a wholesale as well as a retail. I call it wholesale retail. Wholesalers are a retail business because if you're going to do strong R&D, you need to have the scale that wholesale business brings you to be able to execute a retail strategy. So we still see that blend in a lot of the businesses. One of the challenges is how do you manage those two? So when I'm looking at businesses like that, the big question I have is kind of how do you manage the requirements of both groups and how do you separate them? So there's a lot of businesses who rightly have that, but one of the big challenges when we're looking at them from a diligence point of view is how do they play both of those fiddles successfully? So, okay. So has there anybody got a question for us before we wrap up? This is just before coffee. No. Brilliant. I don't know if we'll find out in the feedback. It might have been a terrible first session, but I hope you've all enjoyed that. And I would ask you to grab hold of, well, not grab hold of, but speak to Hayley, Jordan and Christian, who are all here from Q Advisors. They really are the kind of experts in this field and got loads of interesting information for you.